My name is Harriet Putnam and I am 42 years old. For 24 years, I kept the lights on across this town. I traced every fault in the walls. I knew every fuse box by heart. Nathaniel Abbott looked down at his coffee cup. You only know how to handle wires, Nathaniel Abbott said to me. The steel filing cabinet waited against the back wall. It held every record of all my labor. What was sustained by maintenance belonged by unwritten decree to whoever stood at the podium and spoke of sacrifice. The hands that rewired the building were expected to keep quiet. I slowly wiped my palms on my heavy denim trousers. Father Timothy walked past the workbench without looking up. You must remember your place in the parish, Father Timothy said to nobody in particular. I checked the latest docket on the clipboard. The cold numbers never lied, even when the people holding them did. Every single ledger balance told the true story of who built the foundation. Please click subscribe to see what rests inside that filing cabinet. Drop a note below and tell me your home city. This narrative remains a silent reckoning rather than any loud dispute. Every circuit in this town eventually shows where the fault lies. You might wonder how a small workshop ledger handles such a heavy burden over 22 years of continuous electrical service. Stay with me through these pages, because every single invoice tells a very specific truth before the wire finally breaks. I spent 22 years tracing wires through old Portsmouth walls. You learn to look past the plaster and the paint. You look for the exact point where current stops. Every junction box tells a clear story. The surface looks fine to an untrained eye. You must crawl behind the baseboards and follow the copper line until you find the exact spot of the failure. Nathaniel Abbott lived just down the road. He always called me when a breaker tripped in his kitchen. Harriet, fix this switch before dark, he said one afternoon while leaning against the doorframe. I wiped my dusty palms on my rough canvas trousers. I nodded and walked toward the dark hallway. The old metal panel hummed softly under my fingertips. I checked the toggle and reset the main circuit. Everything seemed normal on the surface of things, but a hidden electrical fault always stays quiet until the daily load gets too heavy to bear. I closed the heavy iron door and picked up my leather bag. The rule governed every kitchen table. It lived in the quiet agreements made over coffee. Nathaniel Abbott understood this unwritten law far better than anyone else in our quiet coastal town during those years. Maintenance was viewed as a humble duty. The person holding the tool was merely background noise. Everyone in the neighborhood genuinely believed that steady labor deserved nothing more than a passing nod of polite thanks. Father Timothy nodded along with this philosophy. He sat in his rectory chair and preached about noble sacrifice. The parish always generously rewarded the dramatic voice that spoke of higher callings far above the actual work itself. My green ink logs meant nothing against eloquence. Words always outweighed physical labor in this town. Steady maintenance always belonged by unwritten decree to whoever stood proudly at the podium and spoke of grand sacrifice. The hands that rewired the dark walls were simply expected to keep completely quiet. This belief made upcoming humiliations feel entirely normal. To my neighbors, the arrangement was just how things worked. Nobody ever seriously questioned why the speaker walked away with the title while the quiet electrician walked away empty. Nathaniel played his part with practiced ease. He wore the mantle of the benefactor like a tailored suit. People always nodded respectfully whenever he talked about making heavy financial investments in our shared community and local infrastructure development. My workshop held the real ledger truth. Steel drawers contained every invoice and signed hour. Those careful paper pages quietly mapped out Portsmouth houses street by street without ever leaving behind any missing fractions. Nobody asked to see my metal cabinet. They assumed the electrician had nothing to protect. Complete silence remained my absolute default operating setting in a small coastal town built entirely upon loud public speeches. The coming months would test that silence. Nathaniel prepared his final public overreach. I simply kept my trusty wooden carpenter pencil very sharp and waited patiently for the heavy electrical load to spike. Every circuit eventually reveals its break. You just have to follow the copper back to the source. That physical law governed electrical copper wiring, and soon enough, it would govern every single aspect of our shared lives. Townspeople accepted the hierarchy without blinking. Wealth was measured in applause rather than output. The person who held the microphone always controlled the public narrative while everyone else nodded along in polite agreement. Nathaniel mastered this social currency. He funded small projects with borrowed prestige. Everyone treated his slightest public gesture as absolute proof of deep civic devotion during those long winter months in Portsmouth. My ladder rested against many of their walls. I checked their meters and replaced their fuses. The dark grease staining my canvas jacket proved I was merely working help rather than a true partner in civic theater. A system built on silence invites strain. The breakers cannot hold forever under false loads. Soon the faulty, unwritten rules would trip and the real current would finally surge through the walls of every house. I locked my workshop door at night. An office storage unit remained in darkness. Every single recorded entry remained completely untouched and verified by my own hand, while the town slept soundly outside. No one suspected the records. They trusted the old order blindly. The grand stage was set for a quiet reckoning built entirely upon verified numbers rather than empty public speeches. The wire led straight to the truth. Nothing could stop the signal now. Every concealed flaw was ultimately poised to reveal its true nature in the open light of day. Father Timothy arrived at the workshop before noon today. He wore his black coat over a gray clerical shirt. The heavy metal filing cabinet stood quietly against the back wall. It held my invoices and logs from 22 years of electrical work. He looked around the dusty room with mild curiosity. A small copper lamp rested on the workbench beside my tools. He set his leather briefcase down without making a sound. The weather outside remained cold and gray. He carried a message from the parish committee regarding the upcoming restoration project. I wiped my hands on a clean cotton rag. Nathaniel Abbott walked in right behind the elderly priest. He was 61 years old and carried himself like a man who owned the entire street. He wore a sharp wool suit that smelled faintly of expensive dry cleaning. He glanced at the workbench and then at the back wall. A framed wedding portrait hung crookedly above the door. It showed my parents on a bright afternoon long ago. Nathaniel did not care about old pictures or fading memories. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. He laid it flat on the wooden surface between us. "You need to finalize these service agreements today," Nathaniel said. His voice carried the easy authority of a man accustomed to immediate compliance. I looked down at the crisp paper resting near my tools. The margins were filled with neat columns of typed figures. Father Timothy shifted his weight and cleared his throat softly. He kept his eyes fixed on the concrete floorboards beneath his shoes. The old priest looked uncomfortable in the cluttered workshop space. He adjusted his silver cross with trembling fingers while waiting for my reply. "We have already prepared the administrative paperwork for the parish board," Father Timothy murmured. His voice lacked any real conviction. Nathaniel nodded in agreement and tapped the corner of the sheet. "Just sign where the ink is dry, Harriet." "We have already accounted for the load," he said. He smiled without reaching his eyes. I kept my expression completely neutral. My pencil rested beside the document on the workbench. I did not touch the black pen he offered me. The shop remained very quiet except for the low hum of the wall heater. Nathaniel waited for me to obey without any hesitation. He expected total submission from the local tradespeople. That was the unwritten rule governing every project in this town. The person holding the microphone always dictated the terms. The person pulling the wires was expected to remain invisible. I traced the edge of the workbench with my thumb. Every circuit in this building had a logical beginning and end. I picked up my clipboard to check the morning job sheet instead. Nathaniel frowned at my deliberate delay. He hated when anyone slowed down his careful schedules. Father Timothy turned toward the window to watch the traffic outside. Neither man understood how physical connections actually worked under the surface. They only saw the finished walls and the polished brass switches. They assumed the structure would stand forever on empty promises. I placed the clipboard back down on the sturdy table. The meeting ended without my signature on their neat paper. Nathaniel gathered his documents with sharp, impatient movements. He warned me about missing deadlines before turning toward the exit. Father Timothy followed him out into the cold afternoon air. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them. I stood alone in the quiet workshop for a long moment. My records waited silently in the locked steel cabinet. The foundation of their entire system was full of hidden faults. The parish room felt small under the heavy oak rafters. Nathaniel crossed his arms tightly over his chest. He looked down at the table with absolute certainty in his eyes. "Follow the wire back to the break." I turned the secret phrase over in my mind while the tired old priest adjusted his wire spectacles nervously. "You are making a foolish mistake by refusing our terms today," Nathaniel said. My heavy boots rested flat against the scarred wooden floorboards. The damp air smelled of old paper and forgotten dust. The influential men of this town always expected complete and unquestioning compliance from the working trades who kept the lights burning. "You built nothing that stays without our sanction," Nathaniel said. I felt the sharp sting of dismissal settle deep behind my ribs. A lifetime of labor reduced to a footnote in their parish ledger. The old priest cleared his throat behind the heavy oak desk. He looked uncomfortable with the sharp tone in the room. "We only want what serves the parish community best," the old man muttered defensively while looking down at his lap. Nathaniel waved a dismissive hand through the smoky air. "You are simply the help, Harriet, and the help does not question the deed," he said. My fingers gripped the worn leather strap of my bag. The brass clasp was cold against my palm. I kept my face entirely neutral while they spoke down to me with a lifetime of practiced condescension. There was nothing left to argue with men who own the ink. "You will sign the release before you leave this room," Nathaniel said. The silence stretched thin across the wood-paneled room. I watched dust motes drift through the narrow window beam. Every single electrical circuit I had ever carefully mapped out across the county pointed straight to a hidden structural fault. "You cannot rewrite 22 years of labor with a single stroke," I said quietly. Nathaniel just laughed and shook his head at my stubbornness. The brass hinges of the office door squeaked in protest. I stepped past them without another word of argument. My leather bag hung heavy against my right hip. Every single street in this old town held hidden wires I had personally tested and cleared of deadly danger. They thought the foundation belonged entirely to the voices at the podium. A cold breeze met me on the gravel path outside. The church bell began to ring very slowly across the damp valley for the solemn evening prayer hour. I walked toward my truck with slow and measured steps. The steel cabinet in my workshop held every true record of the work. Let them keep their paper titles for the moment. Time moves slowly when you wait for a fault to show. The hidden electrical resistance builds up very slowly and silently inside the old walls without ever making a sound. Nobody notices the heat until the insulation finally gives way. I climbed into the cab and started the cold engine. Portsmouth looked quiet under the fading evening light. The dashboard lights flickered once before holding steady. I put the gear shift in reverse and pulled away. My workshop waited at the edge of the industrial district. Inside sat the metal box containing every verified invoice. My locked metal workshop storage cabinet waited very quietly indeed at the back of the dark industrial district tonight. I walked home alone. The evening air felt sharp against my face. Portsmouth streets grew dim under gray clouds. My heavy boots made a steady sound on the pavement. Nobody stopped to speak to me along the way. I reached my workshop door and unlocked the iron padlock. Inside, the room remained dark and cold. The old copper coils on my workbench rested in neat rolls. I pulled my heavy leather bag from my shoulder and set it down. Every single shadow in the room reminded me of 22 years spent wiring this town from top to bottom. My steel filing cabinet stood in the corner. I walked over and touched the cold metal surface with my bare hand. This heavy drawer now held every scrap of paper that Nathaniel thought he could simply erase with a wave of his hand. I slid the top drawer open slowly. The mechanism made a dry metallic sound in the quiet room. Inside, I placed the latest job sheet from the parish office alongside my older records. The metal box became my permanent archive for everything the town preferred to forget. Working alone felt different now. I picked up my wire strippers and tested the cutting edge against my thumb. The steel was worn from decades of steady use. Nobody called me for small repairs anymore. The word had gone around the parish silently. People avoided my path when I crossed the market square on Tuesday mornings. I kept my head down and walked straight past them without slowing my pace. Every single house on Main Street had wire that I personally ran through the dark crawl spaces. Father Timothy stayed inside his brick rectory all afternoon. He did not look out his window when I passed by the gate. Nathaniel was busy celebrating his committee meetings across town. The town trusted men who spoke loudly in public squares. My work lived behind walls where nobody ever bothered to look unless a spark flew. I opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet to store a fresh bundle of invoices. The heavy metal drawer slid smoothly on its greased tracks. I sat down at my wooden workbench under the green metal lamp. The light cast a yellow circle over my ledger book. I picked up my blue pen and began writing down yesterday's inventory counts. Every single screw and wire nut was accounted for in columns of neat black ink. The business ran on precision rather than promises. Nathaniel could keep his printed forms and his parish meetings. I had my tools and my records locked securely inside the steel drawers. The workshop door remained bolted against anyone who tried to interfere with my daily routines. Darkness fell over the harbor by 6 o'clock. The fog rolled in from the water and pressed hard against the window panes. I did not light a fire in the small stove. The chill in the air kept my mind sharp and focused on the job sheets. Every wire I ever installed carried a specific load that I calculated by hand. The town relied on those circuits to keep their kitchens warm and their lights burning bright through every winter storm. I closed my ledger book with a firm motion and placed it safely inside the filing cabinet alongside my receipts. Portsmouth kept moving forward on paths I helped build, even if my name was left entirely off the plaque. You still stayed for this part of the record. Does someone in your life treat your steady labor as their property? When a powerful neighbor takes your daily work and calls it their own grand victory, they forget how physics actually operates. Every single wire pulled through a dark crawl space retains the exact signature of the electrician who installed it. Nathaniel thinks his property transfer is completely safe. He will soon find out down the road that heavy daily loads always expose weak joints. The workshop grew cold during the third winter after the property transfer. I pulled my heavy wool sweater tight across my chest while the rain beat hard against the corrugated metal roof. I sat at my wooden workbench under a harsh halogen lamp. The green ledger lay open before me. Every page held columns of neat black ink. Each entry documented materials bought with my own money. Months turned into years with slow, mechanical precision. The town of Portsmouth kept changing its streetlights and upgrading commercial zones. Old wiring failed quietly beneath plaster walls across the county. People called other electricians now when switches sparked in the dark. I did not offer my services to anyone in town. While the town square filled with new merchants, the gray steel filing cabinet gathered more folders in its lower drawers. I opened a drawer to file a bundle of hardware store receipts from earlier decades. The metal runners slid with a dry metallic scrape. Inside the metal housing, stiff cardboard dividers separated thousands of paper receipts by exact street name and local Portsmouth district code. Every single house where I pulled wire was represented here. The numbers did not lie. They recorded exact hours and precise material costs down to the last penny. Father Timothy walked past the window one overcast afternoon. He looked older in his heavy black coat. His thin shoulders curved toward the damp pavement as he hurried past the corner toward the parish hall with a bowed head. I watched him from behind the dusty glass pane. He never glanced toward my workshop door. The community forgot who actually kept the lights burning in their homes. Nathaniel Abbott drove past in a polished new sedan. The vehicle gleamed in the late afternoon sun. He honked at a council member standing near the bakery. His public life expanded across the entire county while mine shrank down to the quiet dimensions of this single workshop room. I dipped my fountain pen into a bottle of permanent black ink. I wrote down the current date at the top of a clean sheet. I checked the columns for a residential project completed long ago. Every single hour of labor performed without proper payment left a very distinct and permanent trace in the dense financial records. The math remained consistent across every single ledger page. A circuit without a ground wire always finds a way to trip. Time worked the same way under sustained pressure. Dust motes drifted through the beam of light above my desk. I reached for a brass paperweight to hold the pages down. The silent rhythm of daily record keeping consumed my quiet evenings while the rest of the town slept soundly in their beds. No one came to visit me in this space. I preferred the quiet solitude of the workshop. The work spoke for itself without needing any voice to defend it. Winter returned again with freezing winds off the harbor. Frost formed intricate white patterns on the single pane glass of the old window while the harbor wind howled outside. I examined an old invoice detailing heavy copper cables purchased for the parish building renovations. Every transaction stood as absolute proof of labor given in good faith. The heavy steel cabinet locked securely with a small brass key kept deep inside my coat pocket. The brass key felt cold against my palm. I tucked it deep inside the wool lining. Years accumulated within those locked drawers without ever making a single unnecessary sound across the long and freezing winter nights. Each month brought fresh invoices for copper and conduit. I filed every single paper with absolute care. The town forgot my name on the municipal contracts long ago. That did not stop my hands from keeping meticulous score of every single hour worked. Spring arrived slowly with melting slush running down the gravel driveway. The workshop windows cleared of frost as daylight stretched a little longer into the evening hours. I walked over to the workbench and picked up my pen. The ink flowed smoothly across the clean paper surface without a single hesitation. Measuring resistance across a frayed circuit taught me patience above all else. You wait for the needle to settle before you make any final judgment. Local council members walked past my property on their way to the municipal building. They wore expensive suits that looked entirely out of place on our dusty gravel roads. None of them looked toward my windows. They assumed my business had vanished completely from the local economy. My records told a very different story in quiet black ink. $14,000 in unpaid labor sat neatly documented inside the gray cabinet. The exact sum remained hidden from public view behind 3 layers of heavy steel. Father Timothy crossed the street during a quiet Tuesday afternoon. He carried a leather briefcase under his arm while heading toward the parish rectory doors. He paused briefly near my mailbox and looked at the painted number. For a fleeting moment, his expression betrayed a sudden flicker of doubt. Then he turned his gaze away and hurried up the stone steps. The church roof leaked whenever heavy rainstorms battered the county. No amount of holy water could fix bad wiring or poor maintenance. Nathaniel Abbott hosted another public dedication ceremony in the town square. I watched from the upper window while men in bright yellow vests set up folding chairs. Nathaniel stood at the center stage, waving at local reporters with a wide smile. His reputation grew larger with every passing month, while mine remained entirely confined to this room. The public believed every grand speech he delivered from the podium. They trusted the man who spoke loudest rather than the person who kept the lights burning. I closed the heavy ledger with a quiet motion. Dust motes danced lazily in the slanting afternoon sunlight cutting across the room. My tools hung in neat rows along the pegboard wall above the workbench. Every screwdriver and tester rested in its proper place, waiting for a demand that would eventually arrive. A circuit left ungrounded will always trigger a fault eventually. You simply need to give the electrical current enough time to finish its work. Winter approached again as the calendar pages turned forward. Frost crept slowly across the corners of the single-pane glass windows. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and sat back down at the desk. The gray cabinet stood firmly in the corner, holding every receipt and purchasing log from the past 2 decades. No one could erase the ink marks on those pages. Truth has a way of staying put when you anchor it with verifiable facts. The copper wires in the wall carried tension silently. Summer heat made the old insulation brittle. My workbench held 30 different dockets from the county office. Each paper bore a signature that lacked any true authorization. The town council believed the paperwork was solid. They did not inspect the crawl spaces underneath the municipal hall. Every joint I had soldered years ago remained on my mind. The weight of 22 years of neglected maintenance pressed down on the rafters. Tension builds in circuits long before the breaker finally trips. That is the nature of neglected wiring under heavy daily use. People ignore the faint buzzing sound inside the partition until sparks begin to fly. Nathaniel Abbott walked into the hardware store on a Tuesday morning. He carried a brown leather folder under his arm. His gray wool coat was buttoned crookedly against the damp air. He paused near the counter and reached into his pocket for change. His fingers fumbled twice with a small brass coin before it dropped. He muttered something under his breath and bent down slowly. Watching him chase the rolling coin made the man look much smaller. For a brief moment, he did not resemble a civic leader at all. He looked like an exhausted senior citizen losing his grip. His shoulders trembled slightly as he straightened up with the coin in his palm. He pressed the metal into the clerk ledger without looking up. Nobody in the shop noticed the hesitation in his movements. I stood by the rear shelf examining a spool of armored cable. My hands were calloused from decades of pulling wire through joists. Nathaniel turned around and caught sight of me near the back. His expression tightened immediately into his familiar public mask. He adjusted his collar and walked toward the aisle with stiff strides. His boots clicked loudly against the uneven wooden floorboards. He stopped 3 feet away from my leather tool bag. The air between us smelled of iron shavings and turpentine. He looked at the ledger pages resting open on my workbench. "You really ought to clear these old papers out of here," he said. I did not look away from the copper strands in my hands. "These records belong to the county projects I completed," I said. Nathaniel shook his head and offered a tired, dismissive smile. "Just sign where the ink is dry, Harriet. We have already accounted for the load," he said. He had used that exact phrase during our meeting in the parish room. Back then, it sounded like an absolute command from a powerful man. Today it sounded hollow, like a frayed wire barely holding its voltage. The phrase carried a different weight now that the ledger columns were fully balanced. $14,000 of unpaid labor could not be dismissed with a wave of his hand. The math was too precise to hide behind empty assurances. The system he built was starting to draw too much current. Minor discrepancies began to show up across 3 separate municipal invoices. Town officials assumed the electrical grid would support the new commercial zoning. They added 3 heavy industrial transformers without upgrading the old junction boxes. Heat built up behind the plaster walls of the municipal basement. Copper conductors expand when the load exceeds their rated capacity for too long. My green ledger tracked every single kilowatt of that undocumented strain. The figures matched the physical reality of the county distribution panels. Truth leaves a distinct thermal signature if you know how to read the meter. Nobody else bothered to trace the lines back to the transformer. Father Timothy crossed the street outside the workshop window around noon. The old priest walked slowly with his chin tucked into his wool scarf. He carried a leather pouch filled with parish collection records. He glanced toward my door but did not break his stride. His loyalty to Nathaniel had cost the rectory its structural integrity. Water had been leaking into the bell tower junction box for 6 months. The parish committee refused to call an electrician because the budget was exhausted. I knew what would happen when the autumn rains finally hit the roof timbers. A short circuit in the belfry would knock out the entire eastern block. The wiring always reveals the truth long before the committee admits defeat. My pencil remained sharp against the page as I finished the inventory. Tomorrow I would open the filing cabinet and check the remaining dockets. The filing cabinet sat quietly in the corner of my workshop. Inside, the logs stayed clean and ordered. You have seen this happen in your own life. Have you ever watched someone else take credit for the heavy load you carried alone? Did you keep your records locked away, waiting for the proper moment to open the drawer? Have you ever quietly built your own proof, knowing patience would demand a full accounting? Tell me if you have felt that quiet weight pressing down. The workshop was cold and quiet. Morning light came through the dusty window pane. A brown envelope sat on my wooden workbench. It held a notarized statement signed by Nathaniel Abbott himself. He had written every word down on heavy cream paper without hesitation. I picked up the paper with 2 fingers. The ink was dark and formal. Nathaniel had signed his name at the bottom with a large flourish. He thought the town would believe his version of events entirely. He thought the papers from the county office would protect him. He was very wrong. "You need to sign this final page right now," Nathaniel had said earlier that morning before he left the shop. I remember his exact words from the doorway. He stood by the entrance with his wool coat buttoned to his chin. I did not move an inch from my wooden stool. The document claimed total ownership of every circuit I pulled. It listed $14,000 in redirected municipal funds as his own personal investment. He signed his name right above the official seal. That signature was his primary mistake. It was written proof of what he had taken from the town over the years. I opened the green ledger on the bench. I turned to the page dated 4 years ago. Every line matched the dates in his signed statement. His own paper proved the exact timeline of the unauthorized transfers. The dates aligned with the moment's power failed on Main Street. Father Timothy walked past the window outside. He carried a small leather book under his arm. He did not look inside my shop. He kept his head down against the cold wind. He knew what Nathaniel was doing. He chose to look away from the ledger columns completely. "This paperwork settles everything between us," Nathaniel had said when he dropped the brown envelope on my desk. I found those exact words printed on page 3 of the statement. He had signed away his own defense by putting his name next to the false figures. I pulled a job sheet from the metal file. The ink on the job sheet was faded from 22 years of dust. It bore the signature of the foreman who hired me back then. It proved I was standing in the dark crawl space when Nathaniel was still sleeping in his warm bed. A person can talk for hours in front of a crowd. A person can make speeches on the steps of the town hall, but ink on paper stays put. It waits for someone to trace the lines back to the source without a single complaint. I laid the notarized statement flat beside the job sheet. The two papers rested side by side on the scarred wood. One was full of grand claims and empty promises. The other was full of copper weight and voltage drops. "You are making a very serious mistake by refusing this offer," Nathaniel had shouted before he slammed my door. I remembered the sound of his boots on the gravel path. He thought anger would win the argument easily. I picked up my blue pen. I did not sign his paper. I marked the date in my own margin instead. The written statement remained on the bench. It was the exact piece of evidence I needed for the records. The shop fell silent again. Portsmouth streets were quiet in the afternoon hours. The metal tools hung from their pegs on the wall. Every wire in the town led back to this room. Every fault had its paper trail. I closed the green ledger with a soft thud. Dust rose into the sliver of sunlight near the door. The paper he signed was sitting right there. It was dated, signed, and entirely unprompted by me. "Let us see how he explains this page to the council tomorrow," I muttered to myself. I placed a small brass paperweight over the corner of the statement. The wind rattled the loose glass in the front window. The record was complete. The system error was caught clearly in black and white. Nothing more needed to be argued today. I sat back on my wooden stool and waited for the next circuit to trip in the cold town. The town hall square filled with chairs for the anniversary assembly. Bunting hung from the red brick facade. Nathaniel Abbott stood at the wooden podium in a tailored navy suit. He adjusted his prepared notes with calm fingers. I walked up the cold stone steps carrying my heavy leather bag. Inside it rested the green ledger and the steel cabinet keys. Father Timothy stood near the side door holding a small wooden box. He looked down at the gravel at his feet. He did not meet my eyes at first. Then he stepped forward and handed me the small carved frame. It held a faded wedding photo of my parents from 1954. "You dropped this at the rectory years ago," Father Timothy murmured to the cold air. His voice was barely audible above the murmuring crowd. I took the frame and placed it inside my heavy coat pocket. Nathaniel raised a hand to quiet the gathering citizens. "We have reached a monumental milestone for our community today," Nathaniel announced to the assembly. I set my leather bag down on the metal chair. The brass latches made a sharp sound against the morning quiet. I unbuckled the leather straps slowly. Nathaniel paused mid-sentence as he saw the rows of paper stack up on my knees. "These pages do not match your speech," I said. Nathaniel stared at the columns of black ink with narrowed eyes. He cleared his throat and tried to force a calm smile. "We can discuss these administrative details later," Nathaniel stated. I shook my head and laid out the signed job sheets. "Follow the wire back to the break," I said quietly. The phrase hung in the crisp autumn air between us. The town hall square filled with chairs for the anniversary assembly. Bunting hung from the red brick facade. Nathaniel Abbott stood at the wooden podium in a tailored navy suit. He adjusted his prepared notes with calm fingers. I walked up the cold stone steps carrying my heavy leather bag. Inside it rested the green ledger and the steel cabinet keys. Father Timothy stood near the side door holding a small wooden box. He looked down at the gravel at his feet. He did not meet my eyes at first. Then he stepped forward and handed me the small carved frame. It held a faded wedding photo of my parents from 1954. "You dropped this at the rectory years ago," Father Timothy murmured to the cold air. His voice was barely audible above the murmuring crowd. I took the frame and placed it inside my heavy coat pocket. Nathaniel raised a hand to quiet the gathering citizens. "We have reached a monumental milestone for our community today," Nathaniel announced to the assembly. I set my leather bag down on the metal chair. The brass latches made a sharp sound against the morning quiet. I unbuckled the leather straps slowly. Nathaniel paused mid-sentence as he saw the rows of paper stack up on my knees. "These pages do not match your speech," I said. Nathaniel stared at the columns of black ink with narrowed eyes. He cleared his throat and tried to force a calm smile. We can discuss these administrative details later, Nathaniel stated. I shook my head and laid out the signed job sheets. Follow the wire back to the break, I said quietly. The phrase hung in the crisp autumn air between us. Nathaniel stepped back from the microphone. The crowd shifted on their folding chairs. People turned to look at the paper stacks on my lap. Every invoice carried a distinct date and a precise signature. The council president tried to wave me away. He motioned toward officials in the front row. I opened the green ledger flat across my knees. The columns detailed 22 years of uncredited labor. $14,000 in material and time sat recorded in black ink. The numbers could not be argued away by a speech. Nathaniel looked down at the wooden floorboards of the stage. His face lost color in the morning light. Father Timothy stood quietly near the brick wall. The old priest kept his hands folded inside his coat sleeves. He did not speak to defend the council leader. He watched the exchange with steady eyes. That was his small redemption on the platform. He let the documents stand on their own merit. I turned another page in the heavy book. The townspeople murmured softly among themselves. They saw the names of their streets written in my handwriting. Every basement box I touched was accounted for here. Nathaniel reached for his printed speech notes. His fingers tapped a nervous rhythm against the podium. He knew the paperwork exposed his empty claims. No amount of applause could fix a faulty circuit. The town square grew silent under the gray sky. I closed the green ledger with a deliberate motion. The brass corners clicked against the wood. I stood up from the metal chair. The heavy bag remained beside my boots. The truth rested in the open air. The workshop door closed. The brass latch dropped firmly into place. I set my heavy leather bag on the scarred wooden table. The room was cold. A single bulb cast yellow light over the workbench. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired. When you trace a fault to its source, you do not smile at the broken insulation. You simply note the damage and calculate the replacement cost. The whole town expected me to demand a total public humiliation for Nathaniel Abbott today. I could have published every invoice across the county board to ensure his complete and utter ruin. That was the path of endless retaliation. But I chose to walk away from it entirely without looking back. I pulled the green ledger from my bag. The pages smelled of ink and old paper. $14,000 sat in black ink on those lines. It was a precise sum for 22 years of uncredited labor. Nathaniel sat in his parlor tonight without any power left to grant or deny. His reputation was burned out like an overloaded transformer. Father Timothy would likely spend his remaining months praying in an empty rectory. I had the legal leverage to force both of them out of Portsmouth before the winter frost set in. Every single property transfer could be reversed through the courts if I filed the correct dockets by morning. I understood the full extent of my legal leverage, yet I chose to let the matter rest where it lay. I opened the bottom drawer of the steel cabinet. My fingers touched the cold metal folders containing the municipal dockets. I could have ruined him completely. I could have taken his house, his savings, and his remaining dignity in a single legal afternoon. I left the drawer shut. Revenge requires a continuous draw of electrical current that slowly burns out the human spirit over many miserable years. I did not want to spend the rest of my life maintaining that kind of bitterness. A short circuit resolves itself in a blinding flash, but it leaves everything around it charred black. I wanted to keep working with my hands on Portsmouth wiring. The window pane reflected my face in the dim light. Outside, the Portsmouth streets were quiet again. People were probably sitting in their kitchens talking about what happened at the town hall. They would figure out the math eventually. Nathaniel would never hold another council meeting or dictate terms to anyone in this county. That outcome was enough. I did not need to watch him beg on the steps of the municipal building. I placed the green ledger back inside the steel cabinet and locked it with a small key. I knew the local system would eventually correct its own structural failures without requiring any further intervention from me. My hands were steady. The workshop hummed with its usual quiet rhythm. Tomorrow, a neighbor would bring in a broken toaster or a faulty kitchen switch. I would test the wires, find the resistance, and solder the connection. That was the work I understood. I turned off the overhead light and walked to the back of the shop. The circuit was closed. The load was balanced. I had nothing more to prove to anyone in this town. I stood in the dark workshop for a quiet moment, knowing the electrical current was finally flowing where it belonged. The workshop floor was cold. Morning light came through the dusty glass panes. I picked up my wire strippers from the bench. Father Timothy came by before noon today. He carried a small cardboard box. He left it by the steel filing cabinet. I did not ask why he brought it. I appreciate the repairs you handled in the sacristy, he said to me. His voice was steady. It mattered anyway. He turned and walked down the gravel path. I opened the box with a pocket knife. Inside lay an old framed picture from the past. It showed my parents on their wedding day. The frame was made of simple tin. My father held his electrician tools proudly. My mother smiled at the camera. I wiped the dust from the glass. I placed the wedding photo on the workbench beside my green ledger. The room smelled of solder and copper wire. Portsmouth moved at its own speed. Nobody mentioned the council meetings or the notarized papers. I checked my inventory list on the desk. Copper wire was running low. I needed 20 feet of heavy cable. My hands were completely steady. The wiring in the old district was safe now. The load was balanced across every junction box. Nothing was forced. I wrote down the supply order in neat letters. Every entry matched the actual material on the shelf. The circuit was closed. The current flowed where it belonged. Father Timothy looked back once before reaching the gate. I just nodded my head. I picked up my soldering iron from the rack. It heated up slowly on the ceramic stand. The red indicator light glowed bright against the metal. I tested the voltage on a spare breaker. The needle swung smoothly across the dial and stopped at 0. I set the tool down on the worn wood. 22 years of labor had finally settled into the walls of this town. I did not need a speech to prove my worth. The lights stayed on when people flipped the switches in the dark. That was enough for any working electrician. I pulled my stool closer to the bench. The metal legs scraped softly against the floorboards. I turned to page 100 in the log. The columns were straight. The ink was dry. I took a deep breath through my nose. The air smelled clean. No storm was coming for us. Nathaniel Abbott stayed inside his brick house across town. I did not care what he did with his remaining time. My workshop door remained unlocked for anyone who needed honest work done. That was the only rule that mattered now. I checked the clock on the wall above the sink. It was nearly noon. Time to cut the wire, time to mount the box. The work went on. You might have thought a 22-year record demanded a public reckoning in the town square. It did not. Some circuits are simply left dead and buildings move on without them. I reached across my workbench this morning. The young apprentice stood by the door with his tool bag open. I picked up the heavy bundle of job sheets and municipal permits. I slid them into his leather satchel instead of locking them in steel. Take these records with you down to Mill Street, I told him quietly. He looked down at the papers resting in his hands. You will need them when you trace the next old fault, I said. He nodded and closed the leather flap. The heavy bundle shifted out of my grasp and into his. I did not ask for anything in return. Some weights were meant to be handed over to someone who still had miles left to walk. You did not have to carry every old breaker box to the end of the road. Sometimes you simply closed the panel, handed the keys to the next person, and walked away into the evening.